thank you for joining us. I am Kate Faulkner, Associate Curator of Education for Public Programs at the Norton Museum of Art. Welcome to tonight's virtual Art After Dark Curator Conversation, where we are presenting the art of friendship. Our speaker, the Norton's Assistant Curator, Rachel Gustafson, will discuss the significant gifts of art from the collection of Esther M and Sumner L Feldberg, and how the power of friendship informs this group of works. The Feldberg collection is on view through March 28th and presents prints and drawings by critical American and European artists of the 20th century. Rachel will also comment on the collaborative bonds shared between some of the artists on view in the exhibition, such as Jasper Johns and Robert Rauschenberg, Christo and his partner Jeanne-Claude, as well as LeWitt and Robert Mangold. As a reminder, throughout tonight's program, you will have the chance to submit your questions and comments through the chat features on YouTube and Facebook. We will dedicate the final few minutes to answering your questions. And now I'd like to welcome Rachel Gustafson.
Hey, Kate, thank you for that introduction. I appreciate it. Good evening, everyone. Hello, and welcome to our virtual program tonight. And a special happy Hanukkah to those of you who are tuning in here on the second night. I plan on lighting the candles right after this myself. So as Kate mentioned, I am Rachel Gustafson, the Assistant Curator at the Norton Museum. And I have the pleasure this evening of telling you a story. And that story begins with a phone call that I received one afternoon in 2018. In my position as assistant curator at the Norton, I typically field all sorts of phone calls, but the phone call I got that day was quite special. On the other end of that call was Esther Feldberg. She was offering to invite Norton curators to come to her home and view her collection. Esther and her husband, Sumner, were moving, and they had a house full of art to contend with. So they asked, would the Norton be interested in taking any of their beloved artworks as gifts? I joined Cheryl Brutvan, who's our head of curatorial affairs and contemporary curator, for that first visit to Esther's home. And it was apparent pretty much right off the bat that Esther and Sumner's collection was impressive. Lucky for us that within the following year, we were able to work with Esther and Sumner to identify 27 artworks that would be gifted to the museum. In several instances, the gifts from the Feldbergs represented the first work of art by that particular artist to enter the Norton's collection. So really breaking a lot of boundaries. Which brings us to today. So next slide, please. Here you see right off the Great Hall a picture from our Cox Gallery. Now this is where the exhibition of the Feldbergs collection is on view at the Norton, and we are absolutely proud to present this sampling of the Feldbergs' generous gift. As you remember, there were 27 objects, so we weren't able to show all of them at once, but we do have a beautiful sampling here that I'll provide a quick overview of before we get to the context of friendship and how the collection began. What we have when we look at this selection is really quite an intimate survey of a diverse group of critical 20th century artists, and it centers on a selection of distinguished works on paper. The works that are included are by artists such as, next slide please, these two examples by Alex Katz. Next slide. Starting at the far left, a work by Roy Lichtenstein, Klaus Oldenburg, David Hockney, Robert Rauschenberg. Next slide. Jasper Johns, LeWitt, Robert Mangold, Leon Polk-Smith, all the way at the end there. Next slide. And on the left, Jan Dibbets and a selection of works by Christo. And if we can have the next slide. So here they are, Esther and Sumner. And in getting to know Esther better, which I have to say was just an absolute pleasure, I came to learn a lot about her history and how the Feldbergs collection took shape. And it really all did stem from a lifelong friendship. Esther was 9 years old when she met her childhood friend, Joan Sonnabend, who had become a Boston art dealer and director of the Obelisk Gallery. Growing up together, their bond expanded, and Mrs. Feldberg's interest in the visual arts widened, the Feldbergs' exposure to a range of established as well as unrecognized artists, and it really impacted their decision to collect. Next slide. And here on the right, we actually see Joan Sonnabend with her gallery partner, Phyllis Rosen. This was taken in the 1960s. And at that time, Joan and Phyllis opened the Obelisk Gallery, which at that time really did have a reputation for being among the most interesting and progressive galleries in Boston. She sold fine artworks by important as well as emerging artists. And then later, in 1973, she opened a small gallery in New York, where she was one of the first art dealers who specialized in artist jewelry, or what I've read she would describe as sculpture to wear. Next slide, please. And here's a lovely Polaroid picture that Andy Warhol took of Joan. And in her gallery of artist jewelry, she would have pins, necklaces, bracelets, and rings made by artists such as Man Ray, Picasso, Arp, and Calder. And again, this picture of Warhol, for me, when I found it, really speaks to Joan Sonnabend and gives life to her art world network. Sadly, Joan did pass in 2012. And in speaking with Esther earlier today, she was happy to hear that we would include Joan in this introduction to the exhibition. Next slide. So recently, we were able to bring Esther into the museum. We just opened our doors not too long ago to the public, and she was one of our first visitors, so we could show her the exhibition and really explain the choices we made when choosing the works that were on view in this show. And we wanted to give her a sample, just as we're showing you today. But those aren't the only artworks on view, because, as I mentioned, the Feldberg's collection is quite diverse. And so it's not just the works on paper in the exhibition that were gifted. And we were able to put on view a large-scale sculpture, actually, in Harris Colonnade. Next slide. Where we see here a Robert Loeb sculpture, which is, again, another Feldberg gift that's also on view. This sculpture was made of hammered aluminum from 1995. And next slide. The first image didn't do it enough justice, so I wanted to show you again here. There's details that better explain or show the artist's ability to mimic the textures of nature. In this example, we're calling the bark of a tree. And so just a beautiful example, and we're thrilled to be able to show it at the same time we're showing the exhibition of their works in Cox Gallery. Next slide. Now, we also have paintings that were gifted from the Feldberg, so I just wanted to give a quick sample of those as well. The Feldberg's gifts included these two examples. To me, the Poussette Dart, which is the painting you see on the left, really spoke to me. There's texture that you can only see in person, and we hope to have that on view soon at the museum. And on the right-hand side, this very elegant still life painting by Ellen Phelan, one of those artists that Joan Sonnabend was very sure to help promote the work of, and someone that Esther really did enjoy collecting. Next slide. And so here we're back at the installation to just give you a tour and to keep the exhibition in mind, because the gift is impressive, but at the core of this is this idea of friendship, and it's the whole concept of this evening's talk, and really thinking about how that power of friendship and exchange not only informed the collection, but also some of the collaborative bonds shared between a selection of the artists on view, such as Jasper Johns, Robert Rauschenberg, Christo and Jean-Claude, as well as Saul LeWitt and Robert Mangold that Kate talked about in the introduction. So that leads me to a segue, because there is one artist in this collection that I did want to talk about that really lines things up nicely before we delve into these relationships, and that is the work of Claes Oldenburg. Next slide, please. So this is a work called Apple Core, and again, Oldenburg providing a very good segue for us. And I did want to point out that this is not going to be an extensive review of all the artists I spoke about and their influences on one another. I think there's probably many books written on the subject of how these interpersonal relationships bind the artists in this exhibition, and there's probably even relationships that I won't get to here tonight. But again, this talk is just to show the threads between the artists, their friendships, their influences, and how that relates to Esther's initial finding and collecting. So again, using Oldenburg as the segue here, this work, to me, reminds me of Oldenburg's interests in the refuse of daily life, but also brings to my attention, and I hope to some of you watching as well, a hallmark artwork at the Norton that also takes collaboration to its core. Next slide. And that is the monumental sculpture outside the Norton Museum, which was gifted by trustee Ronnie Heyman right when the museum opened and was debuted in 2019, along with the new Foster building. Now, this work, I bring it up and I show it because it's the same spirit of collaboration. Oldenburg worked with his late wife, Kuja van Bruggen, on all of their large-scale projects. And so for me, seeing this Claes Oldenburg work in the Feldberg collection just reinforced that idea of collaboration. Next slide, please. So here you have Oldenburg and Kuja shown with a model from their Spoon Bridge in Cherry, which is installed at the Walker Center, just to show you an image of them together. I felt it was quite poignant. And it sets us up nicely for the next slide, where we see this archival image of Oldenburg, actually with his first wife, Patty Muka, who's seen kind of at the bottom of the pyramid there. She also was a collaborator with Oldenburg and often would work on sewing his soft sculpture, which he's quite well known for. But also in this picture, which is from circa 1968, we see Oldenburg at the left. He's the taller gentleman. At the very top of that triangle, you have Lucas Samara. And on the right side with the glasses, George Siegel. And at the very bottom of that pyramid, you have Robert Rauschenberg, who is another artist featured in this exhibition and whose friendship and exchange with Jasper Johns we'll look at more closely in the next slide. Now, I just loved that quote. It was something that is actually in the opening dedication to the oral history project that Sarah Sinclair wrote a book about and who we recently featured in conversation with Cheryl not too long ago. But that quote to me just speaks to this idea of no one can be in this world alone. There are always people you seek out to engage with, to create dialogue with, and many people recognize the relationship between Rauschenberg and Jasper Johns. And here you see the two of them at a quite young age, early on in their careers and their time in New York from 1954. And what's beautiful about the Feldberg collection is what you have are pop art examples, but also their outliers, such as, in my opinion, Jasper Johns and Robert Rauschenberg. So this idea of pop art and its outliers is really a touchstone of this exhibition and a concentration of the Feldberg's collection, and one that they thoroughly explored. Now you see Robert Rauschenberg to the left there, and again with Jasper Johns, and they were among those outliers. Rauschenberg moved to New York in 1949 and studied at the Art Students League, and later met Jasper Johns in 1953, where they really initiated a long and productive creative relationship. Next slide. I loved this photograph as well because it shows, in my opinion, this continued friendship and laughter shared between them. But this is a picture from 1980 at Gemini GEL, which is a critical print shop whom the artist often partnered with. The example from this exhibition that we'll be looking at, their two works, however, were produced at Universal Limited Art Editions, or ULAE, in West Islip, New York, another very critical incubator for printmaking projects. Next slide. So here's the example from the collection. This is a Robert Rauschenberg print. It's called Carillon from 1981. And here in this example, we see imagery that is really representational of Rauschenberg's interest in layering pictures, which he also would capture, take photographs of, but they were usually of the world around him. And in this case, news media, print media, and brings them together in this print composition, which might feel chaotic, but was quite deliberately designed by Rauschenberg. What's interesting here when you consider the relationship between Rauschenberg and ULAE, again, the print shop they're working with, is the founder of that print shop, Tatiana Grossman, only became familiar with Rauschenberg after she was delivering lithograph stones to Jasper Johns. So it's, again, this idea of happenstance and exchange that would have happened because of their relationship. Rauschenberg is today known as a very prolific printmaker, and he continued to set new standards throughout his career for modern printmaking. And, you know, that idea of ingenuity and and experimentation was something that was also very much at the core of his Combine paintings, which is a concept that he developed right alongside Jasper Johns, who also pioneered that idea, where they would take almost a Duchampian approach to found objects and directly incorporate them into a canvas support, or in some cases, just put those objects directly on the wall. Next slide, please. So this is Jasper Johns, and this work is really interesting. It's going to be one that might hurt your eyes a little bit after I explain the idea at play in this composition. Now, this work is from 1968, and it's using one of John's iconic subjects, the target. Like Rauschenberg's print that we saw just a moment before, it was made at ULAE. So Johns created this composition with the idea of a visual game in mind. If you want to play along with me, this is what you'll have to do. Look at the black dot that's at the center of the top target and keep your focus on it for 15 seconds. After those 15 seconds have passed, slowly shift your gaze down to the off-white square below. What will normally happen for some people, depending on your eyes, what you'll see is the previously vacant square space below will actually transfer the rings of the target above, creating a kind of optical illusion where you have a hazy duplication of the target both above and below. Again, feel free to try it 15 seconds before shifting to the bottom. For some people, I know the colors of the rings also invert. So where there's a green ring, you'll see an orange ring and vice versa. I will say for me, that is not the case. I've done it several times and that effect does not come through. But back to Johns and his relationship with Rauschenberg. Johns gained early notoriety at the end of the 1950s for his paintings of everyday symbols, the targets being among them, as well as flags, American flags, the alphabet, and even numbers. And he did that to comment on the self-referential nature of painting. As seen in this work, those symbols would be usually first done in painting and then realized as works on paper later on. Today, Jasper Johns, like Rauschenberg, is among the 20th century's most important printmakers, and having created more than 450 prints in a variety of techniques over his life, quite an impressive number. And before the Feldberg's gift of this example targets, we had only recently acquired another print by Johns back in 2019. So really a transformative moment for the Norton to be able to have now two Johns works from his printmaking techniques and his printmaking processes. So now we'll move on to the next collaboration, and we'll be looking at the work of Christo and Jeanne-Claude. Again, here's another quote to just consider the way that Jeanne-Claude and Christo work together. What's interesting to me about this collaboration, and it's much like the collaboration in certain aspects between Oldenburg and Cuja van Bruggen, is that some people cannot see the connection between what Christo and Oldenburg contributed versus their partners, in that case, Cuja van Bruggen and Jeanne-Claude. But I think this quote really spells it out for us. Christo may be responsible for the drawings, but the realization of their site-specific projects is a collaboration. It's two of them working together. Next slide. So here's a beautiful photograph of the couple here. And for some background on Christo and Jeanne-Claude, they're internationally known for their large-scale environmental projects and installations. And what's interesting from the Feldberg collection is what we have as an example of one of those projects, but an early preparatory sketch that would have preceded the realization of the site-specific installation. Next slide. So this is the realized project. This is called the Point Neuf Wrapped project for Paris. It was realized in 1985, but it took a decade for the duo to see it through. So they really started thinking about this project in 1975, and those are the dates they give to the work, from first conception all the way to realization. I should point out that the Point Neuf is the oldest bridge in Paris and comes with a political background of its own. And it's also a main thoroughfare of the city. The city of Paris is actually where the duo met in 1961. And just another fun fact, because I could not resist, Christo and Jeanne-Claude were actually born on the same day. June 13th, 1935. So if anyone believes in cosmic coincidence, there's something for you to consider. Next slide, please. This is a detail of the same project. I think what you see here a little bit more specifically is the distinctive technique that Jeanne-Claude and Christo are known for. It's called empaquetage, or packaging. And in this technique, the duo wraps objects, buildings, or other landmarks in fabric. And this is really a really beautiful realization of that. Next slide. So what's on view in the Feldberg collection that supports that project? It's this amazing preparatory sketch. It is a unique work. It is not in an edition. And what you see is this idea of Christo drawing the way he envisions the project proceeding. And it's interesting because you actually have two segments. There's the top portion and the separate portion. They are separate, but they are meant to be shown together exactly as you see on the screen here. In fact, on the back of this work, there's specific instructions that tell us that the top segment must be on the top and the bottom segment must be on the bottom. So just a little inside baseball for you all there. As the quote said at the top of this segment, they did execute those site-specific works together, but it is worth pointing out that the preparatory sketches and drawings were all made by Christo's hand. And in fact, it's these preparatory studies that help fund these projects. Christo makes these sketches and other works, and in selling those works, they're able to financially support their urban projects. Next photo. Next slide, please. There we are. So I had to bring these two together. When you see the realization of the Pointe-Neuf project next to the preparatory study, you really get an idea for how closely aligned these are. And I think it's truly remarkable the way that Christo in this preparatory sketch is able to capture the volume of the bridge. And the way he is able to do that is really something that's hard to see on a slide. So this is a work, if you're able to come to the museum, please come and see it in person, because it really, to use a bad pun, speaks volumes to what Christo was able to achieve in this work. Next slide. So before we get to the details of the bottom work, I wanted to point out the significant things at play in the top. So what you have on the left-hand side are actually renderings of the bridge. And on the right-hand side, we have an actual swatch of the fabric that was used to wrap Pointe-Neuf. For me, that was really a fascinating thing to realize, that what we have in the Feldberg's gift here is a memento of that moment, is a memento of that installation. And for that reason, it really was one of the more striking works that I got to research in this show. And recently, we actually showed a documentary that looks closely at the relationship between Jeanne-Claude and Christo. And what I learned in that documentary that I did not know, and it was actually Jeanne-Claude that shared the information, was oftentimes when they would work on projects like this, and usually the fabric was all sorts of different colors, they wouldn't determine the color of the project, the color of the fabric that would wrap the object until the very end. So they would come up with the concept. I think that's shown, next slide, please, a little bit more directly when you look at the bottom portion, because the bottom portion, you see that Christo maybe has colored in a little bit of the canvas that overlays the drawings, but there's none of that golden hue. So it's something that comes on later on in their conceptual process. And what I think when you'll see in just a moment, the choice of that golden or champagne colored fabric, I think must have been done once they were in the city and looking at the sandstone color of basically this historic part of Paris. So again, looking more closely at this bottom segment, Christo's using pencil, wax crayon, pastel, and charcoal to draw what essentially is the backdrop of Paris at the top segment above the bridge. On the bottom segment, again, it's this stitched canvas. So he's using twine and canvas to overlay on top of the drawing to illustrate how the bridge would be wrapped. And again, it's this idea of volume that really can't be construed in this screen image, but one that you'll have to see in person. Next slide, please. but I did try. So here's details that show that bottom segment a little bit more accurately, where you can see the stitching and really the building up of the canvas, almost the folds of the material that really build up the surface of this. And I think it really, again, comes to life when you see it in person. Next slide. And just to close here, again, seeing these pictures slide by side, I think it's important to give some background on this project. Christo and Jeanne-Claude had to organize 300 workers to see this thing through, and they used 450,000 square feet of the golden fabric. And it glistens, and you see in the reflection in the water below that this entire bridge is completely wrapped. And in fact, if you were there in Paris to see this work, the fabric also wrapped the sidewalks. So any pedestrians on the bridge got to walk on top of this gold glistening fabric. And as you can tell, they did not close off the bottom portion of the bridge. So boats passing by would have also seen the fabric if you were to look up at the bridge from underneath as a passenger on a ship. And it should also be noted that this project, with all those workers, with all those fabrics, only remained for 14 days. So the ability to show and document that very interesting and poetic project here in this exhibition with the unique work, again, is just something that is critical and a wonderful example to share with our public. I should also point out that this work is the first Christo work to enter the Norton's collection. Next slide. So now we get to the last collaborative exchange here, and that is between Robert Mangold and Saul LeWitt. I think this quote, again, kind of like our Rauschenberg quote earlier, simple, but it really speaks to this idea of dialogue and exchange that happens. Next slide. So on the left, you have Saul LeWitt, on the right, Robert Mangold, and these are two artists that we would consider minimalist, but Saul LeWitt was also very well known for his contributions to conceptual art. Next slide. This is an example given by the Feldbergs. Now, I should point out that they actually gave two Saul LeWitts to the Norton, so we hope to show another one on view quite soon here. But in this example, I think it's a good representation of LeWitt's refined vocabulary that he uses in the visual arts that really consists of lines, basic colors, simplified shapes, and he applies them his own formula of invention, and really I think that hints at mathematical equations or architectural specifications. And here this work being called Flat Top Pyramid speaks to that architectural quality. Next slide. And this was a work that was actually already in the Norton's collection by Saul LeWitt, but it is a sculptural example. And I think what's fascinating about the Feldberg's contribution to the Norton is in the sampling of works on paper. What we'll be able to do in the future is create a dialogue not only between different artists because of their friendships or their relationships, but between bodies of work by one artist. So next slide here. So now you see the work side by side, and you can really envision in the future one of these works on paper, Flat Top Pyramid, and maybe even the other example that's not on view, being in conversation with this Saul LeWitt sculpture that was already in our collection to really show a fuller breadth of what an artist can contribute. Next slide. And now we come to the work of Robert Mangold. And this friendship is really an interesting one. So Robert Mangold's friendship with the late Saul LeWitt started with a job that Mangold held as a security guard at the Museum of Modern Art. So he worked that job, and in spending the times in the galleries, he became very influenced by the works on view, but also by the people that were coming and going. So when Mangold worked at MoMA in the early 1960s, he would guard the museum's exhibitions. And believe it or not, it was really a common occupation for a lot of artists and poets at the time. I believe Frank O'Hara, the eminent poet, also worked at the front desk of MoMA, and a few others. And it's there that he first meets LeWitt, and they become very, very close friends. And this relationship, takes us back to New York's small but very vibrant downtown art scenes in the 1960s, of which Oldenburg, Rauschenberg, Johns would have all been a part of. And there's another quote by Mangold that I wanted to share because I think it really paints a picture for that community at that time. He says, "There was a group of us who had studios on or near the Bowery. Sylvia Plymouth Mangold, who's his wife, and I were in a building that Robert Ryman was in and Lucy Leopard. Sol LeWitt was around the corner. Eva Hesse was across the street, and we'd all visit each other's studios. Mel Bachner wasn't nearby, but we'd see him quite often, and Carl Andre." So again, thinking back to his quote where he was saying earlier at the first slide that art feeds off art and artists feed off artists, I think that's very true. And it's seen in the art, but also in the recollections of that time. And I think the exchange is really constant. Next slide. Now, what's great about this example from the Feldbergs is that we do have other Mangolds in the collection. And what you see on the left is actually a work by Sylvia Plymouth Mangold, Robert's wife, and another very talented artist who was one of our very early raw project artists, so recognition of art by women. And on the right is a sculptural, it's called a plus painting. It's from a series that Mangold did. Next slide. And that's on view in our Davis gallery. Here's a detail of it that shows it a little bit better. And next slide. When you see these two works together, again, this idea that because of this gift, we're able to have bigger conversations and dialogues about what happens within one artist's oeuvre, I think is critical. And it's gifts like this that make that possible. Next slide. And that really brings us to the conclusion of the talk this evening. And again, none of this would be possible without the generosity of the Feldbergs. Friendship seemed to me like a very fitting way to explore their collection. And it speaks to the ongoing legacy of their efforts to share this collection with the wider Palm Beach community. And now with virtual programs, really anyone who's willing to watch well beyond our county lines. And what you have in this example is really a carryover of the fellowship that really began Esther's interest in the arts with Joan Sonnabend, and how it serendipitously came to the Norton with a phone call on one sleepy day in 2018. And I know that throughout the program, we were asking for more information or more questions from the viewers. So if there are questions, we'd be happy to answer them. But again, I hope you enjoyed tonight's program. And if there are any questions, please share them. If not, I would like to welcome Kate back to close the program out.
Thank you so much, Rachel, for this fantastic lecture tonight. And thanks everyone for joining us. I want to acknowledge the Gail and Paul Gross Education Endowment Fund and Art Bridges for making tonight's program possible. Please remember that Art After Dark happens virtually every Friday night, and we've got a full schedule of virtual performances coming up. Please remember that on December 18th, the Palm Beach Symphony presents a string quartet. On December 25th, enjoy a spoken word performance by the Biscayne poet. And on January 1st, kick off the new year with a family edition of Jazz Friday, presented in collaboration with the Norton Schools Out program. For more information, please visit norton.org/artafterdark. Thanks again, and have a wonderful weekend.